So I'm probably a mile ahead of them when I get to where the accident scene was. And all I've got is a pretty dim headlight. And I and my friends aren't there. Can sort of see that Andrew's maybe still on the rock in the middle of the river, but not well enough to really tell. So I don't know whether he's really dead or alive. And again, I'm having these kind of bizarre hallucinations and fears about what's going on. And, I know it's one thing to have that experience at arm's length, but it's another to be there dealing with it. I didn't really understand what was going on in my brain at that point. Like, I was pretty messed up.
It starts with just taking that leap.
Man, you have to work hard. You have to be incredibly smart.
Choose something that even if it fails, you are going to be proud of it.
Doesn't matter how badly you got beaten in battle.
Be kind, be kind, be kind.
Become a better person, a better leader, the better business.
Go with your gut.
I'm Samuel Donner, and this is Finding Founders.
A beautiful California day turned into a nightmare as Will failed to save his friend's life while running one of the state's toughest rivers. This nightmare frightened him enough to quit kayaking, possibly forever. This is the reality of extreme sports. Often, not even the greatest athletes can conquer these elements unscathed. But it's a risk they're willing to take. Will Gadd stands as 4-time Canadian national sport climbing champion, 3-time Winter X Games gold winner, and the world's first person to scale up the frozen Niagara Falls. Whatever he can climb up, paddle through, or paraglide over, he can conquer. And it all started as a kid exploring the mountains in his family's backyard.
Could you tell me what your parents, either like hiking or climbing, that they used to do?
I mean, I come from a mountain family. There's no other way to put it. My parents were both climbers. And one of the standard Thanksgiving or family holiday sort of stories is my mom going to the doctor when she was pregnant with me. And she had this heinous rope burn on her butt from rappelling on this rope. You sort of wrap around your body in this way, and it burned her. She's going in for her checkup with me, and the doctor's like, "What are you doing still climbing mountains? You're like 7 months pregnant." Yeah. So it's, I got to start climbing before I was born, literally. Definitely a product of the mountains at a very early age. And yeah, I never really stopped.
Do you remember like some of your first like big hikes as like a kid?
Some of my first memories are for sure being out in the mountains. And I remember feeling the vastness of the mountains, just feeling very, very small. It was pretty, it was a pretty atypical childhood in some ways, but I didn't know any better. I thought all kids got dragged into the mountains because a lot of my parents' friends also took their kids into the mountains. So there'd often be a group of kids, and that was at it. That was how we did it.
Was like how you like played with the other kids was just like climbing stuff.
I went to a super alternative elementary school that my parents helped start as well. There was very little structure to it, but it was a great group of people. And I've been lucky to have some pretty good sort of interventions that allowed me to do things differently. In that elementary school, I was a completely ADD kid. And back then, I don't think I would have survived elementary school. So the kids from that school and I would go out and do things both after school and then in the mountains, whether they were camping trips or just going to some campground in the mountains somewhere and get into various kinds of great trouble. It was huge impact on me. And I didn't really realize at the time, but being comfortable in those mountain environments, knowing how to take care of yourself, like what to do when you're cold, how to not get sunburned into a lobster. These are really basic skills that later in my life would become really important. You learn how to survive and be comfortable in extreme environments.
But I imagine even in like when you were growing up, the risk is managed mostly, but there are injuries. There are I imagine even deaths. I remember in our research, we came across a story of when you were 10 and backcountry skiing. Could you tell me about that story?
My parents were part of this thing called the Calgary Mountain Club, and people in that club died. I grew up with more kind of proximity to death. And as a kid, you just think that's normal. That's just how it works. But I think the first time that blew up in my mind a little bit, I was about 10 years old, and we went on a ski tour into the mountains with my dad and another friend. And we got in there and it just snowed a lot. And my dad was kind of like, wow, this is a high avalanche situation. We need to be a little bit heads up. And we skied in there further and it was like, yeah, we're not going to get on big slopes today. And so we stayed in the trees. We're just skiing mellow stuff in the trees. And these people came up the valley and skied by us. And I remember thinking, well, maybe they know more than we do or something, you know, they're going to go further up the valley and ski bigger slopes. And I remember hearing this kind of crack in the clouds, through the clouds, you know, it's cloudy, couldn't see much, still snowing. And this huge avalanche came down. We could hear it. My dad and his friend are like, yeah, we're going to need to do a rescue here. So I had to ski out, 10 years old, skiing out, very, very remote place. And I have to get out to the highway, flag down a car and get a rescue started.
What were you feeling when all of this was happening?
For me, it wasn't a surprise. These things happen. It's obviously not good, but if you're going to do mountain sports, you do need to have a real appreciation of the real consequences and hazards. And that hit me pretty early on. It's like, yeah, we have great times, but if we get it wrong, people die.
Like, how does that knowledge change how you like interact? Does that change like your day-to-day behavior? Does that change how you think about the world? Does it change how you just like interact with people?
That accident made me look at the mountains with much sharper eyes. And if you know the consequences that you're walking into, good and bad, then you can make better decisions.
It never scared you away from it?
It didn't. It scared me in different directions. Like if knowing that people die in the mountains and really getting that on a gut level, it made me choose often different types of trips. And as I've gotten older, and I think everybody that goes through these things in the mountains starts to look at it the same way, you look more at consequence. You're like, what can happen here? Good and bad. And do I want to play this game or not? And for me, the mountains are worth it. But I definitely changed my approach to the mountains in high school based on what I saw.
How did you start exploring stuff more on your own, independent from your parents? And like, what did those first adventures look like?
Yeah, I mean, I got into caving with my dad. You know, again, he was a caver. He was into it. And he worked for Parks Canada. So there were Parks Canada caving trips and things like that. And then there's a really good crew of older cavers. And I became this sort of mascot that would go on these trips. I was like, 10, 12, 14 going on these really hard trips with these guys. And I was pretty fit, and I could keep up mostly. But I had one great advantage, and that was that I was small. So we get to a part of the cave that was too small for these guys to fit through. And they'd be like, send in the probe. And so, I'm like a 12-year-old kid worming through this, like the size of the garbage can in your kitchen hole in rock. They cannot get through this. And on the other side is a whole new world. And I'm there by myself. Like I look back on that and it's kind of madness that my parents let me do this. But on the other hand, it was one of the coolest experiences of my life. I'm literally walking at 12 years old in a place nobody has ever been. And that is a cool thing. That is the wildest exploration, on Earth. And I loved it. But I look back on that, I'm crawling through these tunnels and then maybe they get bigger and I'm walking and then they start getting steeper and they're muddy and I'm climbing down and then it ends in like a 300-foot pit. And I'm making decisions about how far I can go down that slope before it gets too dangerous. And I'm by myself and nobody is ever going to come and get me if it goes bad.
Nobody could fit through.
Nobody could. Yeah. So I'm totally on my own, and to me, that was really powerful. Like you are 100% responsible for all your decisions. And as a young kid to me, and then as a teenager also, that was really powerful. That's what I needed.
What was like the mix of reasons that you wanted to dive into this world?
I look back on it and I can come up with all kinds of intellectual arguments and reasons and stuff, but the emotional, the real reason is emotional in this kind of stuff. It was cool. It also, one of the things that was powerful is I would come back out of these places and tell the adults like, hey, this is what it's all about. And I think a lot of young people crave the kind of like acknowledgement of their tribe and of adults. And they're going, what's it look like in there? And you tell them and you see their eyes light up and you're like, you realize that you did something that you're not getting praised because you got a good grade or whatever. You just did something that is pretty cool. And that's meaning to that community as well. I was genuinely useful.
And then to get respect in that way when you're that young, it's like these choices have impact, and that impact can be felt immediately.
Well, I think that goes to what we were talking about at the start of this. It's like I'd call it agency. Like you have agency to affect the problems in the natural world. Like, can you make it over that rock or not? You've got the agency to do that. And especially when we're younger, we don't have as much kind of general agency in the world to do what we want to do. And so it's especially powerful to young people to have that. And I think our brains are wired for it. We're really good at figuring out whether we can make it over that rock or not.
So you were into caving, but that was kind of like led by your parents. And so I feel like the next interesting progression is getting into like an extreme sport that is not led by your parents, not led by your family, and just like purely because you were interested in it. And that seems to be kayaking. So how did you, and that was like, well, you started that at 14. So like, how did that even start?
Yeah. So I got into paddling when I was 14 in Jasper, Alberta, which is a great place to be a paddler, but they had a kayaking club. And there was some kind of program where you could go and try to learn how to roll a kayak. And at this point in my life, I already had kind of a rule, which is if it seems interesting, you should do it. And I saw some notice about this or something. It's like, you got to show up and try it. You might not like it. You might not last for long, but I saw some kind of like notice, like learn how to roll a kayak.
What does it mean to roll a kayak?
I'll flip upside down, then roll the kayak right side up again. That's like a pretty important skill. And I ended up just going to this pool and I learned how to roll a kayak. There was a really strong paddling community in Jasper of older guys. What ended up working out is these guys just, again, took me in, and I was super psyched on team sports and still am. But this is what I could do on the weekends or if I skipped school or whatever, these extreme sports. So I was just into sports. I didn't care what it was. Like, give me a tennis racket, I'm in. Let's figure this thing out. I'm stoked, And with these more extreme sports, they just had great meaning to me. And, going back to the kayaking thing, that's the first time I learned anything about like sails too, because I had a list on my wall with every paddler's name and number on it. And I'd get home from school, in the months where it was still school and the rivers were starting to run. And I'd start the list and I'd call like Roy and Dennis and Mike and Steve and John. And I'd just work through the whole list and then if I got to the bottom of it and nobody had said yes to taking me kayaking, I'd just start at the top again. And eventually somebody would break and I'd offer greater and greater inducements. It's like, I'll mow your lawn, babysit your kids, and run the shuttle on the weekend, and eventually, but I had, that's what sales is, giving people what they want and making it work for both of you.
Why were you so determined to find every paddler? Just because you just wanted to learn? Yeah,
I needed them. Like I didn't have a car. And my parents weren't going to drive me. Occasionally I could convince my parents to drive me to the river, but they were smart enough to know that I needed somebody else on the river with me so they wouldn't just drop me off alone. And so I had to find somebody to paddle with. These were good guys too. We became quite close. I'm still friends with some of them today, like they're good guys. And without them, I would never have gotten into paddling like that.
So who was the first person on that list that actually like gave you a shot and was like mentoring you?
Well, I mean, that list kind of developed because those are the people that were paddling and they all mentored me. There's a guy named Roy Bromling and Dennis, a couple of these guys, just they're lifelong heroes to me. I'm there for them. They're just awesome. They gave me so much.
Do you remember when you like realized that you were actually like, oh, like I'm good at this now. Like I'm not just the kid that everyone's dragging along. Like I actually have like my own ability in this sport. Like,
I remember running this river and we came to a drop and I saw the line. I was like, here's the line. Let's nail it. And I just saw it. It was clear to me. These guys are like, do you want to run this? And I was like, I don't know enough to run it or not. Like, but it seems like it doesn't look like there's anything lethal here. What do you guys think? And they're like, all right, you probably won't die. You'll just get cold, because I had really bad gear. And I remember thinking, this is pretty much the coolest thing ever. I think shortly after that, I flipped and swam in this glacial river that was like 2 degrees Celsius or 4 degrees Celsius, like 40 degrees, Fahrenheit. It's freezing. And I had lousy gear. But that meant that like I learned really fast to never get out of my boat. And then as kayaking became more serious, there was the Jasper Kayak Club, but there were also the crazies.
Who are the crazies?
They were just good paddlers in town. They weren't really into instruction or doing the great mentoring that I'd had. They were just into running rad rivers. Their mentoring was different. Like I swam once with them, meaning I got out of my kayak and they were like, you're an idiot. You cannot swim. Like, this is bullshit. If you swim, you are going to die. And so I remember going to this lake and having them push me over and try to hold me underwater. And I would try to roll up. And then if I ever did manage to roll up, they'd flip me the other way. And if I swam, it was like, there is nothing more painful than getting told by your heroes that you suck. And so I would do anything not to swim. But those skills stuck with me forever. I think I swam maybe 5 times in my entire kayaking career, and I paddled a lot all over the world.
And swimming is just like when you fall out of your kayak completely and have to like swim downstream.
Yeah, when you get out of your kayak because you got stuck in like a recirculating area of the river and you get flipped over and you can't roll up.
Because when you can't roll up, you're like, just to paint a picture, your head is submerged below the water line and your kayak is like the bottom of your kayak's facing the sky, right?
Yeah, you're hanging upside down looking for fish, and at a glacial river that's really cold, you get a big cold impact on your head. And most of the rivers I learned to paddle in were glacial. And you're hanging underneath there, and sometimes you're getting beat up a bit because you're moving downstream. Maybe you're bouncing off things. Like, you just don't want to be upside down in a kayak for very long. I was testing the limits of what was possible in a way that wasn't going to kill me. These guys would hold me underwater. I'd have my friends do the same thing. And, I figured out exactly how much abuse I could take and still roll up. And then I would get into a river and I'd be stuck in some hole. And I was like, this is casual. I'm getting flipped end for end like a toy in a washing machine. This is good, man. Nobody's even hit me in the head yet. This is great. I'm okay here. I got a breath a minute ago. I can hang in. And so I would call that positive limit testing. And it's really important, actually. People weren't dying kayaking as much. In that group, I don't think any of them died, whereas in the climbing scene, more people were dying. And I was starting to climb more on my own when I was in high school too.
When did you get your first rope?
Yeah, so kind of the test for a climber is like, when did you get your first rope? That's when you call yourself a climber. And I got my first rope when I was about 16. A few other guys in high school, we'd go out and go climbing in the fall, especially when the rivers weren't any good. And that led into ice climbing. My dad was an ice climber, so I could go out with him and do some ice climbing. And that was kind of the start of that.
Were you doing well in like Jasper around like 15, 16? Like, did you feel like you were doing like well in school, doing like what you should be? Or
school was an issue. As soon as I hit sort of 15 or 16, I was really bored and I need high intensity things coming at me. And I think that's what the kayaking and the climbing and everything else did. But school wasn't that interesting, honestly. I did well if the professors or the teachers were challenging me. And in life, I would also need these high intensity experiences. So I became somewhat of wasn't doing well in school. And yeah, there was a lot of sort of petty crime going on. I wasn't malicious, but like, we were stealing beer off balconies, at night in Jasper. So we'd like climb up on this balcony, this hotel, because people would put their beer outside to cool, right? And I'd be like busted moves out with the climbing skills to get up on this balcony and then chucking these cases of beer off the balcony down to my buddies who would like catch them, and I'd always leave something. I'd never take it all. Like, it was total bullshit. It was completely unethical. But in my mind, I was like, well, I'll take the 6-pack, but leave their bottle of rum or whatever, like I never like liberated it at all. But
what were your like parents' response to those like acts of boredom?
Well, yeah, my parents were not psyched on this. This was not cool. And they're like, you're reasonably smart. What are you doing with your life? And I was like, well, I'm making bad decisions. But, I spoke at a jail a few years ago in Canada, place for kids. And I walked in there and they told me these kids, they're not going to like you. They're in there and they don't like authority. They don't like people like you that have their shit together. And I walked in there and I talked a little bit about what my high school experience looked like and that I was basically bored as shit. And, these mountain sports allowed me to find a way to kind of get my hair blown back and in a positive way. And that's kind of the goal of life, is to figure out how to get your hair blown back without going to jail. And these kids were awesome, man. Like an hour later, we're basically, the slideshow is completely collapsed. We're just having this great conversation together. And I just realized there's no difference between those kids and me. I did have some lucky privileges, when I was turning 17, my grandfather actually did have some money, and he looked at the situation. He was like, this is not working out. And if you can get some help from the school, you could go to boarding school and get out of this environment. Took some tests and ended up getting some help and going to boarding school as far away from home as I could get, which was New Hampshire, to this great school called the White Mountain School, which had kayaking, climbing, skiing, and it was perfect.
What was boarding school like?
You succeeded or failed based on what you were doing. You got more privileges if you were keeping your shit together. Like if you kept a good grade average, then you didn't have to sit in study hall all day, after school. I was like, study hall sucks. So I got to get good, better grades. And I was always riding the line, but I got good enough grades to stay out of that mandatory study situation. And if you were responsible, then you got rewarded with things, like positions of leadership. And, I started to grow up a bit too and be a bit less selfish in most ways. And I learned that I did really like, going back to that same thing of some respect and positive use for your community. It's like, I liked being on the river, and I was a better paddler than a lot of the kids there just due to my background. And I was able to be helpful. It's like somebody flipped, I could get on them and get them out of the river, and I could take care of people.
What are you thinking as boarding school comes to a close and you're looking at college?
Yeah, again, luckily I had some resources to go to college, and I'd taken some tests, and I'd done okay. I'd stayed out of study hall, so I had decent grades, not stellar, but solid. And looking at schools, and honestly, geography determined what schools I was looking at. I was not looking at schools in Kansas. I knew that I needed to be in the mountains. And I needed to do a lot of activity. I figured out I needed like 3 or 4 hours of decent activity a day to be a functional member of society, or at least an hour, but like 3 or 4 was better. Like that was the system at boarding school. 8 to 12 was school, and then 12:30 to 3 or 4 was some kind of activity. So I knew I needed a school that would allow me to follow that program, and it needed to be in a geographic area that had these sports. So yeah, I chose my school based on who would let me in, but also where they were. And I somehow got into some decent schools and wound up in Colorado at this place called the Colorado College, which was awesome too. And then I would do the same thing, go to school in the morning. I never took an afternoon class at CC. I'd go to school in the morning, go outside and do my thing, and then study as much as I needed to at night.
So what were you interested by initially? Like, what were you thinking that like actually kept your attention? I got a tremendous amount of value out of school, but at the time I was primarily interested in maintaining a decent GPA. So, my grandfather would keep funding the bills, but I knew I had to get a career. So at first I thought I would be a doctor because my grandfather was a doctor, and I was like, that's pretty cool. And I really admired him. So I was like, okay, I'll be a doctor. And then I met this thing called organic chemistry and labs. You got to sit nobody told me about this. You got to sit in a room in Colorado looking up at the mountains, and you're supposed to like take your Bunsen burner and, get fractions. So this was just not on. And the professor came to me after I'd missed by like 4th lab in a week, because they were in the afternoon. And he was like, this is not working out. You should drop this class and, go do something else. So the doctor idea died. And then I was like, well, what else could you do that like makes money and, seems interesting? And I've always enjoyed talking with people and debating things. And I'd done some things in school with debate projects and so on. I was like, I'll be a lawyer, and I took a semester off to work for this judge, federal district judge. And at the end of it, he's like, you've showed up, you've done a great job. You're not too stupid to be a lawyer for sure. You could make this work. But this outdoor thing, it's clear you really love this. And I think I'm happy to write you a great letter of recommendation is what he said, but you should do this outdoor thing. And Judge Hall. And he knew that I loved the mountains, and I loved like the kayaking and all the sports that I did there. And I was already starting to guide a bit and teach a lot in these areas. And he was like, somehow you can make this work. And his name was Judge Hall. And I actually got in contact with him because that moment was really, really important in my life. A couple of months ago, I found his son on the web, and I wrote him, and I said, hey, Judge Hall, thank you very much for doing this, because you really, I couldn't be who I am today without that decision. Yeah. And then I was also starting to write. I had a really good professor at that point who encouraged me to write. What do you write about?
Well, I was going to different events. That was in the very early era of sport climbing competitions. And I was competing in these competitions. Again, they were interesting, right? Like you show up, you compete, you either suck, you don't, you figure out to suck less, and then you go back and you do it again. So I love this stuff. It's awesome. But anyhow, so I would go to the competition, I'd write about the competition, and I won some of them, but I lost most of them, as you do in sports like that. And so I'd write about what happened. And I'd also, gotten into a few others. So I was writing about mountain biking. I was pretty into mountain biking and anything. I'd write about anything. I wrote for my school newspaper and amassed a bunch of clips of my writing, which is what you needed to do to get a job. And then I had another good stroke of luck. I called Climbing Magazine up and I was like, hey, you guys need an intern. And they literally said, what's an intern? That was not in the vocabulary at all at that point. I was like, I'll come there and work for free. I'll make coffee, and I'll try to be useful around the office. And you just show me a little bit about this world. And again, it was a value proposition. It was sales.
And how big was like that magazine at that point?
Well, Climbing Magazine was really small. I think their circulation was about 30,000, maybe less. And my social media has way more reach than that today, which is kind of funny to think about. But again, great people there. There's a guy named Michael Kennedy who ran and owned the magazine, and Alison Osius, some of the other people there. They did not have the opinion that my writing was any good. They're like, yeah, this is pretty savagely bad. So here's what you want to do with this. And I am eternally grateful that they gave me real feedback on my writing. And I got a couple of small pieces published, which I read them now and I'm like, they're painful to read. But
what was it like working there? So so you had been going to all these climbing events, writing a little bit there. That was enough to get you a quote unquote internship at Climbing Magazine. But what was it? Because this was you were on the leading edge of a lot of this stuff being popularized. Because now you look at all these climbing movies and you look at Alex Honnold is like a full blown celebrity, right? And so it's now everyone kind of gets what this whole world is, and it's exciting, it's interesting. But before, it was kind of relegated to maybe some pieces in National Geographic. It wasn't as known in the whole vernacular. People didn't take as much interest in it. And so I'm curious what a magazine like that actually looked and functioned like. Was there an office that you went into? What did it look like? Who was working there? Was it just everyone was outside all the time? What was it actually like working at one of those places at literally this is the beginning of this movement entering into a more mainstream, I guess, consumer,
so Climbing Magazine had an office in Aspen, Colorado. So I was sleeping in my truck and then going into work. I was showering at the health club. I got a membership to the health club, and occasionally one of the people who worked at the magazine would take pity on me and invite me in for a night when it was really, really cold, because it was in winter in Aspen, which is pretty chilly. Anyhow, so I'm going for it. And it was a really well-run office. That was a well-run business. Michael Kennedy was a smart guy who valued his people, and I didn't know it at the time, but I still look back at that business for inspiration on how to run my own. But it was exciting. Climbing was starting to take off a bit. And these were people who were passionate about climbing, but there wasn't really such a thing as a professional climber to any degree. I was pretty good at climbing, but in my mind, I had to be a professional at something else who went climbing. I learned that you could, make a living working 40 hours a week and go climbing a lot and do something that you cared about. I worked on some good stories with good people, and it was interesting work. I really did enjoy it. And I was still competing in these climbing competitions.
This was emblemized the lifestyle that you wanted to. So when you said people were climbing, what does that mean? They would be climbing for a story, or with someone who was also climbing? What does that mean?
In the summer in that office, what people would work until 5 o'clock and then go climbing until dark every evening. And if you went out climbing at lunch hour and you were an hour late, that was cool. But they would also pull a 20-hour shifts to get the magazine out the door, which is very much how I work. I would much, that was kind of the magazine world back then. It was booming in some ways. Magazines were, especially the climbing ones, were doing really well. And people were, it was a lifestyle thing, but people worked hard. They were professionals. and you did what was necessary to move that magazine forward. For this judge, I was allowed to go down and talk to people in cells, and the judge would be like, go talk to this guy, see what's going on. And they would never do this today, but they just let me into the cell with like this person who was in there for some pretty heinous crimes. And often again, they weren't very different than me. They just didn't have that break in life. And it really stuck with me. I also started to feel like I needed to stop bluntly fucking up as much. I started to value the breaks that I'd been given. You know, it's like, wow, this is not, I've been lucky here. Like, I kind of need to do something with this. And so that was that sense of like, yeah, you got to capitalize on what you have a bit. And that was one of the, and then Climbing Magazine was another time where I was like, okay, I'm not a great writer, but I can write. By the end of it, they were letting me write, the smallest pieces of the magazine in the back or whatever. But I was like, yeah, I could do this. And I did. I was like, I need to make a professional career that also allows me to do these mountain sports and that has interest to me. Around that time, a few of my friends and I went to California for spring break. So I was still in school, and we show up at this river. We're going to run this, one of the tougher rivers in California, a run called Golden Gate. And it's pretty legendary. I think it's about 15 or 18 miles of pretty continuous class 3 to 5 plus drops, meaning drops that are really at the upper end of, certainly back then, what was considered feasible to run in a kayak. But we were all paddling really well. We knew we were good. We were paddling well in Colorado, and we're solid to try this type of run. We felt, yeah, we were in the right place. This was not out of spec for us. But at the put in, these other guys showed up, and they were, kind of legends in Bye-Bye of California paddling. And they're like, can we paddle with you? And one of us knew one of them through some kind of family relationship or something. So we went from 3 to 5, bombing down this river. We're going fast. We have to speed scout because we're trying to run this thing in a day, and it's long. I don't know if it had been run in a day at that point. So we're banging down this river, and speed scouting is the guy in the front stops, comes up to the drop, hops out, looks, says, go right, go left. It kind of gives directions to everybody else still waiting at the top of the drop in their kayaks, and then they run it. So I'm in the lead, banging down, come to this drop, and it's just manky, meaning there's no clean line that I can see. It's like rocky over here, kind of skid. I just don't like it. It's not that big, it's not that serious, but I don't like it. So I said, hey, everybody out of their boats, let's have a look. Everybody looks at it. Okay, sees lines. I'm still not really sure what I'm going to do. It's easy to walk around it. There's no point in running this thing. Everybody's already out of their boats. Like, let's just drag our boats around the side and the rocks. We back in 30 seconds and out of here. Like, for me, it just didn't seem like that great of a risk, really. Like why run it? But what the hell? You don't want to walk. Walking's not cool when you're kayaking. So, my buddy Jimmy gets into his boat and paddles off the drop, pins vertically, meaning his kayak is, straight up and down with the nose in the bottom of the river. And all the water pouring over that drop is landing on Jimmy's back. So he's stuck there. He cannot get out of his kayak because he can't get his knees out of the cockpit, the hole in the boat. He's stuck. And I'm like, holy shit, Jimmy's going to die. And I go for my throw bag, and I knew a little bit about crevasse rescue and tactics like that, how to work with ropes from climbing. And I was the only one there that had any experience in that. So I go for that gear, but somehow Jimmy, who's the most amazing athlete I think I've ever known, he does this crazy thing where he like surfs with his body across the water and dislodges his kayak. Absolutely amazing. And one of the biggest reliefs in my life is watching Jimmy like come out the bottom of that drop. And I was like, oh, that's so great. And one of the guys that we just met gets into his boat. And I'm young, I'm like 21, and this guy's old. He's like 30, eh? And I didn't really know what to say to him. Like, Jimmy almost just died. Like, why are you getting into your boat? Like, there's no way in hell I would run that drop. That's the best I had at that point.
Yeah. Like you said, like these guys were like the legends that you like respected.
Yeah. Anyhow, off they got pins, goes over the drop, pins, same place as Jimmy. And I tried various tactics to get him unstuck, and I did eventually get him out of there. And all of a sudden we're doing CPR on a rock in the middle of a beautiful California sunny day. And, I can't bring this guy back. And Jimmy and I are elected, because we're better paddlers in the group. We're elected to run the rest of the river and get help. So I left my other friends doing CPR on this rock, and Jimmy and I bang out, run the whole rest of the river.
What are you feeling?
Well, it's just horror. At that point, when somebody really does die, unfortunately, you see it. And it's hard, it's a hell of a thing. So my main concern was to focus on what was necessary, which was to get the hell out down that river. And I would think about Andrew, the guy who had the accident, and it would blow my mind up. And I'd have to go, no, I can't think about that right now. I got to do my job, which is to get down this river and get help. That's it. It was this incredible sense of horror. So I've been going for basically like almost 24 hours straight and it's dark, and I'm going up this river to where I know the accident scene is. Now it's like 5 a.m, just about to get light. And I've been paddling and hiking and moving straight for a very, very long time. And I'm starting to hallucinate that Andrew is behind the rocks and he's going to jump out and kill me because I didn't save him. And seeing the body bag fly overhead, it's a hell of a thing. And I basically quit kayaking at that point and didn't paddle again for about a year or a year and a half after that point. And it was not worth it. Then my friends and I, we got back in that car, drove back to Colorado, and went to school on Monday. And I didn't really understand what was going on in my brain at that point. Like, I was pretty messed up, but I'm back in class. I try to figure out like Plato and Socrates on Monday morning. It's like, that's a hell of a thing.
Did you and your friends talk about that after? Like, is this drive just silent on the way back? Like, how are you even?
I think all of us were trying to process it in our own ways. We talked about it, but we were so, we were in sort of a, now I would call this, we were mentally injured. We'd taken a kick in the head and we didn't really know what to think. There was no debrief. There was no discussion. I just felt incredibly guilty as the only person in that group that had any skills with ropes. I didn't know I couldn't save this guy. Even though I didn't know if I was going to paddle ever again, I really obsessively read up and gained knowledge. I was like, I need to, get better at these rescue systems that are applicable to climbing as well as paddling or anything in life, really. Like, I had a lot of like PTSD stuff that I just didn't understand. Like, if anything startled me, I'd punch it.
That's not something that many people around you go through. So it's like the resources are often hard to find or non-existent.
Well, I think as I've gotten older, and I've been through some other experiences like this in the mountains since then. And one of the things I'm very much trying to do is change how we talk about these incidents. Certainly at that point, if you had an accident in a kayak or skiing or whatever, you did stupid shit and you're basically mocked. And that was very much the kind of culture at that point in the mountain sports world. And today you still see it online. If somebody goes out and has a wreck skiing, a lot of the skiers are like, well, why didn't you know that at 2:00 on Thursday, the facet layer was going to release in this angle and this aspect? Why were you skiing there? Of course this was going to happen. But there were 50 people out there who skied that aspect that day, or 100 or 1,000, and it didn't go. And these are called accidents because people don't see them coming. They're not willfully ignorant. They might not know enough to prevent it. They might not have all the skills, but they're just people who go out and have accidents. And this is the human condition. And this is what's going to happen. And I think that's changing. That attitude is changing a bit in the mountain sports world.
So coming off of that, like you're 21, you're going back to school. What is that just experience life of kind of like reintegrating into school after that? And then also, how do you start moving more towards writing again?
I had a good course in school where I wrote I think it's probably a pretty good story. It's never been published. I've never published it. One day I will share that story with the world about that wreck. That was my way of dealing with it. Was to write about it. I think I got one of my relatively rare like A+ at school for that story because it was a hell of a thing. And I wrote about it honestly. And then, but I didn't talk about that with other paddlers or people in the outdoor communities.
Did your teacher that graded that like say anything to you about that story?
Not much, no. At that area, you just didn't talk about them. You just kind of went for it. That's what you did. You pick up the pieces and go on. And you do have to do that. But one thing I did do is choose at that point to climb in less complex environments. And now I have language for it. But at that time, I didn't. Like, I knew growing up, the people who tended to climb bigger mountains tended to die. And so I chose to go in more into what's called sport climbing, which is relatively short, very well protected climbs where you use a rope And the goal is kind of like to go so hard you fall off. Like you want to climb up the most overhanging, radical things you can possibly pull out of your body. And you go until you see spots and explode off the wall. It's kind of like what the Olympics are now. It is. That's sport climbing in the Olympics. And these competitions started happening. So I started going to them. And, people would still like break an ankle or something, but people weren't dying. So I started training really hard and got into that. That led to Climbing Magazine also as well. Like it opened up some doors by focusing on that because it helps to be recognized as being good at something. And I was pretty good at this and that helped. Like,
who was recognizing you?
Well, again, it's the peers in the community. It's like you walk up and you climb a route that has been done very rarely. And people are like, who's the kid who just sent the thing? I'm like still relatively young and I just found it fascinating. So I started competing in these sport climbing comps, graduated from school, and I was sort of paying for the lifestyle by writing about these comps, going to them. And it was a pretty hand-to-mouth existence. So I actually ended up getting a job at another magazine called Rock and Ice in Boulder. So it was more regular, but it was still flexible. I could go to the comps. I was flying over to Europe, go to comps in Europe and working at this magazine. George Brock's a great guy also. And kind of developing my career as a writer and editor, and then also competing and traveling. But I was always broke because like a flight to Europe, I was like a junior magazine editor, man. A flight to Europe was like a month's salary. So I'd bust over to Europe, come back with like my $250 credit card limit maxed. And it was just really, really hard to make this work. And I was always so broke.
Did you have any people that you looked up to where it's like, oh, wait, like this guy is like the North Star of what could be possible in this world?
No, like there are people who were sort of making a living as professional climbers. But one of my great failures in life is that I never really believed, and I don't think I am in some ways, like that I could be those people. They were somehow special. So it's like they could do that. And then also I just had this like thing where I was supposed to have some sort of career. That's just how I was raised or whatever. It's like, I got to have a career. Like you can't be those people. And I was sponsored. Like I won the Canadian National Sport Climbing Championships 4 times. I think I was competing at an international level and making the semifinals most of the time. Like I was good.
So why didn't you believe that?
One thing is that there wasn't enough in just physical motion. I do need to do something with my mind. And so if I were on a sport climbing trip for like 6 weeks or 2 months, I'd actually start to get bored. And so eventually I just got tired of living on rice and beans and hot sauce. And it was also an angry period at climbing, man. We were super influenced by the punk scene. They gave me a lot of the values that I run today. It's like, be yourself, don't bullshit, and try. Like that's the ethos of punk music. There's one skill I have in life. It's I'm going to try. It might suck, but I'm going to try. And that is a very punk thing. I don't think I've ever thought I had any special degree of talent, but I can try. And so I called up Climbing Magazine. These are the pivotal moments in my life where I did try. I called those kayakers up. That's my special skill, is I'm willing to try and get shut down and try again.
When did you end up with Rocky Mountain Sports Magazine?
I remember competing in my last U.S. Nationals, and this kid named Chris Sharma won that event, who went on to like become an absolutely legend in the climbing world. But I was like, that kid's the future, and I clearly do not have that level of skill. So I'm out.
How old were you?
I was like 25 maybe. And I worked for a climbing company, and I was kind of their all-purpose marketing manager, design guy. I don't know why they gave me this job, but it was a great guy who ran it, horrible businessman. And I learned a lot about how not to run a company and how not to run business with this guy, which was super valuable.
What was wrong with how it was operated?
Well, we had really good products, but rather than fulfill the orders for those products, this guy would tend to start new products. And I'd worked for other businesses where it was like, you have to balance the spreadsheet or whatever. And eventually I wound up working in another magazine called Rocky Mountain Sports and Fitness. And the guy who ran that company, John Windsor, was a very smart guy, and he was actually good at business. So he hired me to be the editor of his magazine. And it was a general sports magazine, big outdoor component, but we also covered like road running and triathlons. And so I'm editing this magazine, have a staff of like another editor, some writers, some salespeople that, don't work for me. And, but it's a pretty good scene. And I'm at a great group of people in Boulder, Colorado. And it was a real job. It had like actually a real salary. And then there wasn't enough room in that magazine for all my words as editor. So I walked into John's office. I was like, we need a bigger magazine. I got like stories to cover here. You guys got to sell some more ads so we got more space. And he was like, that's a really good idea. Well, you are now the publisher. So now I'm in charge of the sales side of thing and the editorial side of thing. And I know nothing about sales, right? And so kind of a key moment for me, I walked into this bike shop with my sales guy, and this bike shop was a big bike shop, but it was a local bike shop, and I was like, hey, dude, I got this great magazine. Like, it's totally perfect for your readers. And, why don't you advertise in here? Here's a contract. And he looked at me like I was an idiot, because I was. And he just headed it back and said, no, I don't think so. And I walked out. My sales guy was like, okay, I need to work on your approach. So we went through it. I walked back in after getting some coaching. I was like, hey, you got a great shop here. And I know you also run events out of this. Could we maybe cover one of your events, write a story about that, and, do a small advertising contract and work together a bit? And he's like, yeah, and signed the contract. And that was the beginning of sales. It's like, give people what they want, which is what I'd done as a kid, as a kayaker. I'll mow logs. I just had to go back into that mindset of I wasn't selling something. I was giving people what they want and making it useful for both of us. And the magazine started kicking ass. All of a sudden, it's like the magazine did grow. And then we started getting national clients like Nike and Reebok. And that was pretty cool. And so that was neat. We sort of grew up. These regional sports magazines became more of a thing.
Was there a moment where you felt like, oh, wow, like this is working?
Well, I remember we would go to these big trade shows to try and sell advertising. And there are other magazines at Sports and Fitness Publishing. So there were other publishers and salespeople that would go to there. And I realized that my little magazine was pulling in more national level clients than any other magazine like it. And in fact, most of our advertising revenue was now coming from these big national people. And I was like, this is pretty cool. And you go to these big trade shows, like, I'm a kid from Canmore, Alberta. Like, this is a different world, man. There's a lot of stuff going on that's pretty out there. And I just loved it. Is you walk in there and there's the head guy for Nike advertising, and you're doing contracts with him. And I'm like, this is pretty cool. Or her, and I just loved it. And that magazine grew, and then it got fatter. All of a sudden, this like 24-page magazine was like 96, 108. And you're like, this is pretty cool. But this sort of kept happening. And there was a small events division at Sports and Fitness Publishing. And John Windsor was like, hey, well, you've done well on this publishing thing. Why don't you take this event side of things and we'll roll it into this company too? So next thing you know, I'm running an event company too.
So it sounds like you were instrumental in massively growing this magazine. What did that feel like to be kind of at the helm of that? I gotta say, I love this. Like, business is as fascinating as anything else to me. And to John's credit, he gave me enough rope to hang myself, and that he'd help pick up the pieces when it went bad. But that was a very entrepreneurial, like, what can we do kind of company. It was total bootstrap. And, the people there, they taught me amounts about how businesses work and why. And I got really good at running spreadsheets. It sounds I'm an extreme sports athlete today, but I can still do a kick-ass spreadsheet. I do. I run my life with spreadsheets. But just figuring out how to take an idea, like what, we'll put back then college newspapers, university newspapers were a big thing. So we started a magazine that got put into those newspapers for our advertisers. And we started a music magazine that did that. We did all this crazy stuff. And we just invent these projects. And I had good relationships with the advertisers. So we'd walk in there and say, hey, Reebok, we're going to go this thing. It's going to go out to 250,000 college students in the U.S., university students in the U.S. Are you in? And we'd name some kind of exorbitant ad rate because there was nothing else like it. And it would work, and we'd hit. So we did all kinds of stuff like this. It was just awesome. It seems like things are going well on that side. Where are things with all of like the extreme sport stuff that you're doing?
I'm still ice climbing, and I'm still going out. And I'd also gotten really into paragliding because Boulder's a great place to fly. So I'd like leave at lunch, and John was totally cool. Windsor, the guy who run that place. So he'd be like, yeah, you're gone for 2 hours, but your sales numbers are great. And to me, that was very much that's still how I run my life. It's like, if you're hitting the metrics and your performance is good, then do whatever the hell you want.
How did you gear up towards like competing in the X Games with ice climbing?
So during this whole time, I'm still rock climbing, not at a international competition level, and I'd gotten back into kayaking. Gear was better. American boats had big cockpits on them, but I'm still doing this, like still the same program. Work hard, go do cool stuff at lunch or in the evening that's physical, and Sports and Fitness Publishing had that culture for sure. And I'm still going ice climbing, but I kind of burned out on ice climbing because there wasn't very good ice climbing, relatively speaking, in Colorado. And the only way at that point for me to push it harder was to make it more dangerous. But about that point, this new thing called mixed climbing came along. And it was basically like climbing up overhanging rock walls to get on giant icicles. And it was protected well, generally speaking. You weren't going to die. It had that sport climbing element. You used a rope, so if you fell off, it was, usually you just fell off into space because it was steep. And I saw pictures of a friend of mine named Jeff Lowe doing this. And I called him up right away. I was like, Jeff, this is the coolest shit ever. I want to go climbing. And he's like, right on. So I'm driving over across Colorado to go ice climbing over to your Vail every weekend and just loving this stuff. It's great. Things are going pretty good. Along comes this thing called the X Games, and Jeff was in charge of building the wall. So I got an invite. I showed up at the first one, and I placed 5th. And I drove back or flew back or whatever back home and just couldn't get this thing out of my mind. It's like I knew I had the athletic talent from my background in sport climbing and stuff. It's like, why didn't I win this thing? And the answer was the guys who won, they were climbing 5 days a week and working 2. And I was working big weeks and climbing pretty hard, but just I couldn't put the time into it, nor could I train on ice. And also at that point, I'd sort of reached this, I wouldn't call it pinnacle, but this place in my career where I wasn't really sure what to do next. I'd had a lot of great successes. I was making, for that time in my life, really good money. It was an interesting job, but I was like, how do I take this further? And that's always been my question. Like, how do I take something further, whether it's caving, kayaking, whatever? And I wasn't really sure. I think I was also wrestling with some, there's another paragliding wreck not that long before that I had to respond to. And again, I think probably there was a bit of PTSD going on too that I just didn't recognize.
What happened with the paragliding?
Oh, just another horrible accident. We're in a paragliding competition and it's a beautiful day. We're in Telluride and this guy launched, and which is fine. That's what we're all going to do. It's perfect. Launches, goes out, does a few really big wingovers, which are like a mild aerobatic, but they can go bad really fast. And this guy's wing collapsed. So this guy goes into the ground from 150 feet with no canopy. And I think, that left a mark as well. It also made me think about how long we're all going to live. Just felt like I was getting older at 29. I hadn't been able to make the pro sport climbing thing work, and I really wanted to. I just couldn't figure out how to make it work. But now I was like, I know what the value of media is. Like, I just won the X Games. There's all those photos of me in the X Games. I hadn't won at that place, but I placed 5th. And all these photos of the mixed climbing I was doing were running all in the magazines that I used to work at, because it was so cool, man. This lit the climbing world up. Like, you can climb giant icicles, no shit. This is really different. This is wild. And I knew that had value, because for a full page magazine ad at that point, I think I charged about $3,500 or $4,000 in my magazines. And I was like, all I've got to be able to do is get a company to pay me like 1/3 of this cost for this ad if their stuff's recognizable in it, and I can make a living.
So what was the steps to try to do that?
I quit my job. I was like, I really should see how good I could get at this ice climbing thing and try. Like, it would be pretty cool. If I could win this thing, I win enough money to live for basically a year. I went back and basically removed everything in life but the goal of trying to win the X Games. And that was a really important lesson. As I look back on it, that was the first time where I really said, this is what I am going to do. And I was like, okay, I'm going to just try to focus on doing this. And if I have to pull espressos to do it, that's what I'm going to do. And that's what I did. And a year later, I won both events at the X Games for ice climbing. But I also had a really good stroke of luck. There were competitions in Europe. So I was flying over to Europe and I was bringing back Red Bull because it worked.
And this was just for purely just like, I need energy. I need to stay awake.
Yeah. So I got Red Bull's like, hey, do you want some free cans? And I was like, yes, please. That'd be great. And I had no idea where that was going to lead to. But again, it was a good opportunity, and working with them, they're like, okay, we're going to brand your helmet. And I was like, sure, nobody else wants to put anything but stickers on it, and so I won the next games. The next day I won like a bunch of medals at the X Games, and I'm kicking ass, and I'm flying in paragliding comps and doing really well at that too. Won the Canadian and US nationals for that. Everything's going pretty good. And I was still writing about these things, making films, and that was what filled the kind of intellectual component for me. And then they canceled the X Games.
At that point, were you like, oh shit, now here goes away all my sponsorships? Or did it feel like you had enough of a platform to make something happen?
No, this is kind of pre-social media days. So without other media, I have no platform. I need to be on TV to make this deal with Red Bull work. And I had the great good luck to get in with Black Diamond and some other companies and work on gear. And I was like, it's done. And then my athlete manager at Red Bull was like, hey, we do these things called athlete projects. And, you can go and do the cool stuff you can think of doing with your sport. Do you have any ideas?
And like, there would be like a film crew that followed you?
Yeah, there'd be a film crew. And it was really early days. And I was like, well, I'd love to climb icebergs. Can we go climb icebergs? So we go out there in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Newfoundland. And there's these big icebergs bobbing around out there, but they're heinous. They roll upside down regularly. They're melting on the bottom. They're melting on the tops. They flip all the time. Like it's mayhem. But, I'd sold Red Bull, like making a little film about this. And all of a sudden I'm a film producer.
And what was it like climbing with the crew?
Well, yeah, and I was used to working on cameras because of the X Games and the media and stuff. That's fine. I'm good with that. But just trying to keep them safe, I wouldn't let them on the icebergs because I was like, if I kill myself, that's kind of my choice. But somebody who's there for a job, you can't do that. Like, guys, I was pretty careful with how I structured that. And after 4 or 5 of these icebergs, I just realized that if we kept playing this game, we were going to get killed. Like, it's just a bad idea. So I had to call Red Bull up, be like, hey, really sorry about that. At that time in my life, it was a lot of money. It was like $100,000, and that's still a lot of money. But I was like, really sorry about that. But we only climbed like 6 of these icebergs, and the film's going to be kind of short. And it was really beautiful, and we'll make something out of it, but not really optimum. And I thought that was going to be the end of my career.
And so what did you end up turning that into?
Those photos went everywhere. They showed up in like the New York Times and the San Francisco Chronicle or whatever these huge newspapers and huge media platforms of the day were. And I looked at the ad buy costs, these things, and Red Bull does some analysis of this too, but like that was one of the best value projects Red Bull ever did for the cost and return on it, even though we nominally failed. And all of a sudden it was like, it switched my brain around. It was like, oh, wait a minute. We can create this stuff. We can do this stuff. And it's really good value. Like that is always one of the things. I've never taken money where I felt like I wasn't giving good value in the relationship, and I was like, this is good value for Red Bull. And they saw it too. They're like, what other ideas do you have? I was like, it's 25 or 26 years later. And they've also, we've had some failures together too. And for sure, things have blown up, and Red Bull's been, to their credit, and Black Diamond and Arc'teryx. I'm with the same companies now. I've been with all of these companies for at least 20 years.
But I guess like how have those relationships changed, and your relationship to the sport and like doing these like feats changed to today?
Nothing's really changed since I was a 12-year-old kid. It's like, what's the coolest thing we can do this weekend? And that's still luckily how I run these projects. Like every year I come up with 10 or 12 ideas. I pitch them. Most of them get shot down, but somewhere inside of me still beats the heart of a sales guy. It's like you make enough calls, you work at it, you learn, you get it done. And failure is part of that. You got to accept that. And actually, I never accept it. I hate sucking. And when I can't get one of these things to hit, it's not the world's fault. It's my fault. Like I suck. How do I get better at it? And so I break it down and try again. And some of these projects and ideas I've pitched for up to 10 years straight before they've hit. Some of them still haven't hit. I get told no like 90% of the time, but that 10% is magic.
So what is like one of those projects that you're working on now that you're most excited about?
Well, for almost 10 years now, I've been pitching this Antarctica project. And a lot of what I'm doing is helping scientists reach inaccessible areas of the world. That's become kind of the new thing in my career. The previous projects with that have been in Greenland, where I'm helping scientists get underneath the Greenland ice sheet and study how that meltwater that we're all reading about moves through that ice sheet and how much that contributes to sea level rise and why. These are fascinating stories to me. Like, how does that work? So Antarctica is the current focus. And I hope to go in either December 2024 or January 25. And it's an interesting project. Again, this thing has failed so many times. I've pitched this literally for 10 years. And I think it's going to hit this year. And I'm pretty excited about it. It'll be a cool project.
So like looking back at like your career and your life up until this point, like what do you think is something that you might tell your younger self, or to someone maybe like that might be trying to do something like this now? Like what advice do you think you would give that person?
I think some of these are kind of cliches, but they're cliches because they're true. One piece of advice I'd give to younger people is that very few people are actually all that special. You know, I grew up thinking that the people who were in whatever role were special and that they had innate talents that I didn't. And over the years, I've seen that there's a lot of talented people in the world. They're everywhere. But it's the people that really work hard at what they believe in that end up at the top of whatever field it is. The other thing I would say is that, you know, people look at what I do and they're like, oh, you're following your passions. And there's some truth in that, but passions come and go. And I was really passionate about that girl in 9th grade, man. Awesome. But my interests are enduring. My interests in exploration, figuring things out, doing interesting things. Those are enduring. Creating things like whether it's, you know, a new run on a river or a new business project or, you know, climbing icebergs. Like I've always been interested in trying to figure out how things work and understanding the world. That's an enduring interest. So I would listen to those interests. You know, you might be passionate about football in high school or whatever, but your interests might be in how teams work or getting people to do complicated, whatever it is. You know, like everybody's got really powerful interests. And I think finding ways to line those up. And then the final thing I'd say is just that nothing's forever. Things change. So rather than fighting that, accepting it. What I found interesting when I was 25 is not what I find interesting now. You know, things do change. I still want to grow and accepting that and not being bitter when things change. It's like, I'm pretty stoked. I'm 56 years old. But I'm pretty stoked. Like, life's pretty interesting.
Thank you so much for listening. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe, rate the podcast 5 stars, and share with a friend. If you have any questions or comments, DM us at Finding Founders Podcast on Instagram, LinkedIn, or Facebook. Finding Founders is produced and hosted by me, Samuel Donner.
Our audio editing team lead is Ashley Jimenez, with support from
Jessica Morales, Miley Lipton,
Siyu Pan,
Kenny Wright,
Josie Yo,
Matt Fernandez,
and Merritt Hill.
Our outreach and research team lead is Desiree Nunez, with support from
Marissa Granados,
Monica Lee,
Sarah Tiersma,
and Yao Liu.
To see more of what we're up to, subscribe to our newsletter at findingfounders.co. Thanks again for listening, and see you next week.